I used to tell my third graders that every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The truth is, some stories have a hidden beginning you don't discover until you're already deep inside the middle. Mine waited 32 years before the truth came out. It started with a small, harmless curiosity on a rainy Sunday in Oregon, the kind of day that makes you want to organize a closet or bake cookies you don't really need. Cody had taken Hunter to the garage to help with something that sounded suspiciously like an excuse to use a power drill, and River was finally down for a nap after waging a small war against his blanket. I sat at our kitchen table in our little house in Corvallis, watching water bead and slide down the window. The neighborhood smelled like wet cedar and mud and the faint, comforting aroma of someone's fireplace. My laptop was open in front of me, a mug of tea going cold beside it, and a DNA kit confirmation email glowing on the screen. I'd ordered it because a coworker at Linwood Elementary wouldn't stop talking about hers. "You've got to do it, Brandy," she'd said, eyes bright like she was offering me a winning lottery ticket. "It's like a map of who you are." I'd laughed, stirring powdered creamer into my coffee in the teacher's lounge. "I already know who I am. I'm tired." "You can be tired and still have ancestors," she'd replied, shoving her phone under my nose and pointing at a chart that looked like a pie someone had taken far too seriously. But I hadn't ordered the DNA test on a whim, no matter what I told her. The truth was, I had wanted to do it for years. Not because I felt unloved. Susan and Greg, my adoptive parents, had never hidden the truth from me. They told me early and told me kindly. I grew up knowing I was wanted, knowing I belonged. But adoption leaves small, quiet blanks in a person. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that ruins your life. Just little empty spaces where other people have answers. At the doctor's office, when forms asked about family medical history. In school projects when other kids traced eye color through generations and I had nothing to trace. Sometimes in the mirror, when I caught my own reflection at an angle and wondered who had given me that face. I didn't resent those blanks. My life was too full for resentment. I had Cody, who made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs and kissed my forehead when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I had Hunter, 4 years old and permanently sticky, who asked, why, like it was his full-time job. I had River, too, with a laugh that made you forgive him for every tantrum and every attempt to climb furniture like a tiny mountain goat. Most days I was too busy being Brandy Owens, teacher, wife and mom, to sit around wondering who I had been before. Still, curiosity has a way of lingering. Late at night, usually, when the house was quiet and Cody was asleep beside me. Who did I look like? Did I have my mother's eyes or my father's smile? Were there brothers or sisters somewhere who shared my laugh or my habit of biting the inside of my cheek when I was nervous? Had I been loved before I was adopted? That question stayed with me the longest. Not every day. Just enough. So when my coworkers started talking about DNA tests and family matches, something in me leaned forward. Not because I expected anything dramatic. Just because I wondered. When the little white box arrived in the mail, I told myself it was casual. A little curiosity. Maybe a breakdown of countries. Maybe a distant cousin in Minnesota. But when I dropped the sample in the mail, I realized I had wanted more than percentages and maps. I had wanted a door. I just didn't know that when it opened, my entire life would be standing on the other side. The results were supposed to take weeks. They took 3. On that rainy Sunday in Oregon, I logged into my account and watched a polite little loading wheel spin while my heart beat slightly faster for no reason I could explain. Then the page refreshed. A colorful breakdown appeared, percentages, regions, maps. Mostly Northwestern European. A small pinch of something else. Nothing surprising. I sipped my tea and almost clicked away. Then my eyes fell on the section labeled DNA matches. A list of names appeared. Faces relationship estimates. And at the very top, in bold letters, the website suggested, close family, parent, child. My breath stopped. The name beside it was Linda Eaton. Below that, Michael Eaton, close family, parent, child. For a moment I stared at the screen, waiting for it to apologize and correct itself. It didn't. And suddenly, the quiet little curiosity that had led me here didn't feel harmless anymore. It felt like the beginning of something that had been waiting 32 years to be found. I stared as if the screen might apologize and correct itself. It didn't. I thought about Susan and Greg and felt a little guilty. "You were chosen," Susan used to whisper, brushing my hair back, her fingertips soft and careful. "We waited for you. We wanted you so much." And I believed her. I still do. But now on my kitchen table, my laptop was telling me something new. 2 names sat on the screen in front of me, names the website believed belonged to my biological parents. Parent, child. Those words don't belong to an adult who already has children of her own. They belong to someone else. Someone with a different beginning. My fingers moved before my brain caught up. I clicked on Linda Eaton's profile. A woman with warm eyes in her photo, brown hair pulled back, smiling like she was holding back tears even in a still image. The site showed shared DNA, 49.8%. My hands started to shake. I pressed my palm against the table, as if I could hold myself in place. I clicked Michael Eaton. A man's face, older, a serious jaw, eyes that looked like they'd been through weather. Shared DNA, 49.7%. I scrolled down again, numb, and saw other names with high matches. Melissa Eaton, estimated relationship, sibling. Jason Eaton, estimated relationship, sibling. The room tilted. I could hear the refrigerator humming, the soft tick of the wall clock, River's white noise machine faintly hissing from the baby monitor. The ordinary sounds of my life became distant, as if I'd stepped underwater. My mother and father had the same last name. Maybe they had stayed together. And the two sibling matches meant I hadn't come from an empty space after all. I had come from a whole family. I closed the laptop. Then I opened it again, because denial is a reflex. The results stayed. For a long time, I sat there without moving. Rain tapped at the window like impatient fingers. My tea cooled into something I didn't recognize. I kept thinking, this is a mistake. But DNA doesn't make mistakes like that. Not parent, child. The door from the garage opened, and Cody's voice drifted in. Babe? Hunter wants to show you the spaceship he made. I tried to answer. My throat didn't obey. Cody appeared in the doorway with Hunter perched at his side, both of them smudged with dust and pride. Mom, Hunter yelled, holding up a mess of cardboard and tape. It's for when we go to the moon. I stared at my son's face, so clearly mine in the shape of his smile, and something sharp twisted in my chest. Cody's grin faltered. Brandy? What's wrong? I forced my lips to move. Cody, can you come here? He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly, the way they did when he was bracing for news. Hunter sensed the shift and quieted, suddenly shy. What is it? Cody asked, softer now. I turned the laptop toward him, my hands trembling so much I had to press my elbows into the table. He leaned in, read the words, and for a moment his face was blank, like a mind trying to catch up with a body. Then his eyebrows lifted. Parent, child? He said, voice flat. I nodded. Who are these people? I don't know. My voice cracked. But the website says they're my biological parents. Cody looked at me the way you look at someone you love when the world starts to fracture beneath their feet. He reached for my hand, grounding me. Could it be, like, some kind of glitch? I shook my head. Not like that. Not with two matches. I swallowed hard. Cody, what now? Do I write to them? He stared at the screen again, then at me. Okay, he said, as if choosing the word carefully. Okay. We breathe. We don't panic. But panic isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's what happens when a hidden door opens, and you see a room in your life you didn't know existed. That night, after the boys were asleep, we sat on the couch with our phones and the laptop. Cody made coffee even though it was late. I didn't touch mine. I clicked on the message button for Linda Eaton and stared at the empty text box. What do you say to someone who might be your mother? Hi. Apparently I'm your kid. My fingers hovered over the keys until they ached. I typed. Deleted. Typed again. Finally, I wrote, Hello. My name is Brandy Owens. I took a DNA test through this site, and it shows you as a close match, possibly my biological mother. I've always known I was adopted, but this is still very surprising to me, and I'm not sure how to process it. If you're open to talking, I would appreciate it. Thank you. I read it aloud. Cody nodded gently. Send, he said. I clicked. A tiny swoosh icon flew the message away, as if it was no heavier than a paper airplane. But it felt like I'd thrown a brick through a window. The next morning at school, I taught math like nothing had happened. That's the strange thing about being a teacher. You can be falling apart and still make laminated fraction strips with a smile. My third graders buzzed around their desks, arguing over whose pencil had the best eraser. Someone spilled a cup of water, and I handed them paper towels, my hands moving automatically. My classroom smelled like crayons and disinfectant wipes. I wrote multiplication on the board in my neat teacher handwriting and heard my own voice explaining arrays, while inside something screamed. During recess, I stood outside on the wet blacktop, watching kids race in jackets too thin for Oregon drizzle. My coworker who'd suggested the DNA test, Kelsey, walked over and nudged me. "You get your results yet?" she asked, cheerful. I stared at her like she'd handed me a live grenade. "Yeah," I said. "And?" I swallowed. "It's complicated." Her grin faltered. "Complicated how?" I shook my head. "I can't," the words stuck. "I'll tell you later." Kelsey studied me, then nodded slowly. "Okay." "But, Brandy, are you okay?" I wanted to say yes, because teachers always say yes. Instead, I looked away and watched a boy chase a soccer ball like it had personally insulted him. "I don't know," I admitted. That afternoon, my phone buzzed while I was cleaning the classroom, stacking books and smoothing desk name tags. I checked the screen and felt my stomach drop. New message, Linda Eaton. My fingers went numb as I opened it. "Brandy." I don't know what to say. I've been waiting for this message for more than 30 years. "Can we talk? Please." I'm crying as I write this. "I'm Linda. I'm your mother." The room blurred. I sank into my teacher chair behind the desk, staring at the words like they might vanish. Waiting, more than 30 years. My breath came in shallow bursts. I typed with shaking hands. "Yes. I can talk. I'm scared and confused, but yes." She replied immediately. "I understand. You have every right to be. I want you to know, we never stopped looking for you. Your name was Debbie. Debbie Eaton. You were taken from us when you were 3 years old." My hands flew to my mouth. 3, taken, kidnapped. The world went silent except for the blood rushing in my ears. I read the message again. Then again. I stared at the classroom around me, the bright posters, the student art, the neatly labeled bins, and felt like I was wearing someone else's skin. Cody met me in the driveway that afternoon when I got home, like he'd been listening from my car. The sky was low and gray, the kind that makes Oregon feel like it's holding its breath. I stepped out of the car and he saw my face. "Oh God," he said, and crossed the distance in 3 strides. "What happened?" I showed him the messages on my phone. His arm tightened around my shoulders as he read. "Kidnapped?" he whispered. I nodded, trembling. "She says I was 3. Cody's face hardened in a way I'd rarely seen. Not anger at me. Anger at the idea. "Come inside," he said, voice firm. "We'll figure this out." Inside, the boys were playing with blocks on the living room rug, oblivious. Their laughter hit me like something holy and fragile. I wanted to scoop them up and lock all the doors and never let the world touch them. But I didn't want to scare them. I didn't want to turn their safe world into a place where their mother looked haunted. That night, Cody and I talked in whispers after bedtime, sitting at the kitchen table again, the same place my life had split open. Linda sent more messages, careful and steady. She told me she lived in California, in a town I'd never heard of, but suddenly felt like a distant echo inside me. She told me about my siblings. Melissa, 3 years older than me. Jason, 6 years older. She told me about my father Michael, and that he'd aged in the way people age when grief becomes a permanent roommate. She told me about the day I disappeared. "We were at a small park," she wrote. "Your sister was on the swings, your brother was chasing a ball. You were playing in the sand." I looked away for a moment, just a moment, to help Melissa with her shoe. "And then you were gone." There was a woman. She had been smiling. She asked me a question about the water fountain. I didn't think anything. "And then you were gone." I stared at the message until my eyes burned. How many parents have looked away for a moment? How many mothers have tied a shoe and trusted the world not to steal their child? My chest hurt with a new kind of empathy that made me nauseous. I wrote back, "I don't remember." Linda replied, "That's okay. Your brain might have protected you. We have photos. We have your little pink jacket we never could throw away. Your sister kept your favorite stuffed dog until she was a teenager. She used to talk to it like it was you." I pressed my forehead against the table and cried so hard my shoulders shook. Because somewhere in California, a family had been frozen in a moment of loss, and my life had been moving forward without them, like a train that didn't know it had left passengers behind. The next piece of the story came like poison dripping into clear water. Linda asked if I knew about my adoption agency. I told her what I knew. The adoption had been arranged through a company called West Coast Family Services, a name printed in faded ink on a folder my adoptive mother had kept in a box. Susan had shown it to me when I was 18, like it was a relic of something sacred. "They helped us find you," she'd said, voice thick with emotion. "We were so grateful." Linda's messages slowed, as if she was gathering courage. That company, she wrote finally, was not real. It was a front. They took stolen children and sold them to desperate families. The police said it was part of a larger ring. They called it trafficking even back then, before people said the word as much. We were told you might have been taken overseas. Then we got a call years later, but the trail was cold. I felt my stomach flip. Cody read over my shoulder, jaw clenched. So your adoptive parents, Susan and Greg, didn't know? I don't think so. My voice was small. They thought they were adopting. They were just people who wanted a baby. I pictured Susan's hands smoothing my hair, her voice saying I was chosen. I pictured Greg teaching me how to ride a bike, jogging beside me, panting, laughing when I almost toppled. They weren't villains. They were my parents. But now the word parents had multiplied in my life like a math problem I didn't know how to solve. That weekend, I drove alone to Eugene to see Susan and Greg. The drive from Corvallis was under an hour, but it felt like crossing into a different life. Trees blurred past, dark green and dripping. I kept gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles hurt. Their house looked the same as always, neatly trimmed shrubs, a wind chime on the porch that tinkled softly. Susan opened the door before I could knock, like she'd been watching the driveway. "Brandy," she said, relief in her voice. "Honey. We were just—" She stopped when she saw my face. "What is it?" Greg asked from behind her, stepping into view. I walked inside like my legs belonged to someone else. The living room smelled like lemon polish and the faint scent of Susan's perfume, comforting and suddenly cruel. I sat on the couch, hands folded tightly. Susan perched beside me, her eyes searching mine. "Did something happen with the boys?" she asked quickly. "Is Hunter sick? Is River—" "They're fine," I interrupted, and my voice sounded too sharp. I softened it. "They're fine." Greg sat in his armchair, leaning forward. "Then what is it?" I took a breath. "I took a DNA test." Susan's eyebrows lifted, confused. "Oh." She laughed a little, weak. "Well, that's modern for you. Did you find out something about your biological family?" I stared at her. My eyes filled. Susan's smile fell. "Brandy." "What?" "I matched with someone," I said, the words tasting like metal. "Two people. It says they're my parents." The silence that followed felt like a heavy blanket dropping over the room. Greg's face paled. Susan's mouth opened, then closed. "It's real," I said, voice cracking. "Their names are Linda and Michael Eaton. They live in California." And I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing the next part out. "They say I was kidnapped when I was 3. That my name was Debbie." Susan made a sound I'd never heard from her, something between a gasp and a broken sob. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Greg stared at me, blinking as if he couldn't focus. "Kidnapped?" he repeated. I nodded. "And the agency?" "West Coast Family Services. Linda says it was a scam. They stole children and sold them." Susan shook her head violently. No, Brandy, we did everything right. She stood abruptly, pacing. "We had home visits. We had paperwork. We had—" "I know," I said softly. "I think you didn't know." Susan stopped pacing and looked at me with raw fear. Are you saying we—" "No," I said, moving toward her. "Mom, listen. I'm not accusing you. I'm telling you what the DNA says. What they say happened." Susan's eyes crumpled. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God." Greg's hands were shaking. He rubbed them together like he was cold. "We loved you," Susan said, suddenly fierce. "We love you. You know that, right?" "We didn't, Brandy, I swear we didn't." "I know," I said, and my own tears fell. "I know you love me. That's what makes this—" I broke off, choking. Greg stood and crossed the room, slow as if he was approaching something fragile. He put a hand on my shoulder. "If this is true," he said, voice rough, "then someone hurt you. Someone hurt another family. And he swallowed hard. We benefited from it without knowing." Susan sank back onto the couch, sobbing openly now. I sat beside her and let her cling to my hand like I was still a child. For a long time, we cried together. Later, when Susan's breathing had steadied, she looked at me with swollen eyes. "What do you want to do?" she asked, voice trembling. "Are you going to meet them?" I stared at the carpet, at the familiar floral pattern. My mind flashed with images of Linda's profile photo, her eyes like a question that had been asked for 30 years. "I don't know," I whispered. Because the truth was, I didn't. I wanted my life to stop changing. I wanted to press rewind. I also wanted, strangely fiercely, to know what it felt like to stand in a room with people whose blood matched mine. To see if their faces would unlock something in me, like a key turning. I wanted answers, even if answers hurt. That night, after I tucked Hunter and River into bed, Hunter asked me, "Mom, why were you crying today?" His innocent little face destroyed me. I sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his hair. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're confused," I said carefully. He frowned. "Are you sick?" "No." I smiled, forcing warmth into it. "I'm okay." He considered this, then said, "If you're confused, you can ask me. I know a lot." I laughed wetly. "You do, huh?" He nodded solemnly. "Like, did you know dinosaurs don't have school?" I leaned down and kissed his forehead. "I did not know that." As I walked out of his room, I thought about how, in my classroom, I taught kids about families in neat little categories: parents, siblings, grandparents. I made art projects for Mother's Day and Father's Day, trying to include everyone, trying not to make any child feel left out. But families aren't neat. They're not categories. They're choices and accidents and love and loss. The next week was a blur. Linda and I moved from messages to phone calls. The first time I heard her voice, I froze. It was soft and shaky, with a California warmth that felt like sunlight through a window. "Debbie," she whispered, and I flinched at the name. "My name is Brandy," I said quickly, too quickly, because I wasn't ready to be someone else. "I know," Linda said, voice thick with tears. "I'm sorry. I'm trying. It's just, my heart has said Debbie for so long." I squeezed my eyes shut. "You can call me Brandy," I said. Then, after a pause, "Or, maybe you can call me both." "I don't know." Linda made a sound like relief and grief colliding. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, honey." Honey, that word did something to my chest. She told me about my childhood, what little she could. About how I loved peanut butter sandwiches and refused to wear socks that felt wrong. About how I called my brother JJ and followed him like a shadow. About how Melissa used to braid my hair too tightly and then apologize. Some of it felt like fiction. Some of it made my skin prickle, like a faint memory trying to surface. And all the while, my daily life continued. I packed lunches. I corrected spelling tests. I read Charlotte's Web, aloud to my class, my voice steady even as I felt like I was floating above my own body. Cody became my anchor. At night, when I curled up in bed staring at the ceiling, he would pull me into his arms and say, "Whatever you decide, I'm here." But deciding felt impossible. Susan and Greg were my parents. They had raised me. They had loved me. They had made mistakes. Every parent does, but they had never hurt me on purpose. Linda and Michael were something else. They were the people whose DNA made my DNA. The people who lost a child and kept breathing anyway. How could I choose? It wasn't like choosing a team or a favorite color. It felt like choosing which half of my chest I could live without. One evening, Linda asked if I'd be willing to video call with the whole family: Michael, Melissa, and Jason. I stared at my phone, heart pounding. My instinct was to say no, to delay, to protect myself from the moment when faces became real. But something in me, something stubborn, said yes. Cody set up the laptop on the dining table. He sat beside me, his knee touching mine. His presence was a steady weight. When the call connected, the screen filled with a room in California. Warm light. A couch. 4 people crowded together like they were afraid if they left space, I might slip through it. Linda was in the middle, clutching a tissue. Michael sat beside her, shoulders squared, eyes red-rimmed. Melissa and Jason hovered close, both crying openly. For a second, no one spoke. We just stared at each other. Then Linda whispered, "Oh my God." Melissa leaned forward so close her face filled the screen. "You look like Mom," she sobbed. "You look like us." Jason wiped at his eyes with the heel of his hand. "I thought I'd never see you," he said, voice breaking. I used to look for you in crowds." Michael's mouth trembled. He smiled and said, "Hi, sweetheart." Sweetheart, my breath hitched. I stared at their faces, searching for something familiar. Melissa's cheekbones looked like mine. Jason's eyes had the same shape as Hunter's. Michael's jawline echoed in my own smile. Linda's expression, soft, earnest, aching, felt like it should have been in my life all along. I pressed a hand to my chest, as if my heart was trying to climb out. I don't know what to say," I managed. Linda nodded quickly, tears spilling. "You don't have to." Just let us look at you for a minute. So I did. I let them look. And I realized something terrifying. Part of me wanted to crawl through the screen and into that room. Part of me wanted to be held by the people who had been missing me for so long. And another part of me wanted to slam the laptop shut and run upstairs to Susan and Greg's house and pretend none of this existed. After the call ended, I sat in silence, shaking. Cody wrapped his arms around me. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. I laughed bitterly. "Like I'm being torn in half." He kissed my temple. "You don't have to decide tonight." But the question haunted me anyway. In the following days, Linda sent photos. A little girl with curly hair in a pink jacket. A girl sitting on a kitchen floor with peanut butter smeared on her cheek, grinning. A family photo at a beach, the sun bright on their faces. And there I was. Except I wasn't Brandy. I was Debbie. A child I didn't remember being. I stared at those photos late at night, after Cody was asleep, after the house was quiet. I felt like a thief looking at someone else's memories. Then Linda sent another photo, one I hadn't expected. It was a picture of a missing child poster. The kind you see in old movies. At the top, in bold letters, "Missing, Debbie Eaton, age 3. My face stared back at me in grainy black and white. Under it, the date, May 1993, the year I disappeared. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. I thought of my own children. I pictured Hunter's face on a poster. River's bright eyes reduced to a photo and a plea. I wouldn't survive it. I wouldn't survive one day of it, and yet Linda had survived decades. That night, I went into Hunter's room and watched him sleep. His mouth was open slightly, his hands curled around his stuffed bear. I brushed my fingers over his hair so gently he didn't stir. A sob rose in my throat. I swallowed it down. I realized then that my confusion wasn't just about loyalty. It was about identity. I had been Brandy for so long. I had built a life on that name, on that story. Teacher, wife, mom, Oregon. If I became Debbie again, what happened to Brandy? Did she vanish? Did she become a lie? Cody found me sitting on the edge of Hunter's bed, tears sliding down my face. He crouched beside me. "Hey," he whispered. "What's going on in that head?" I wiped my cheeks. "I keep thinking about them," I whispered. "About Linda. About losing a child." Cody nodded slowly. "Yeah. And I keep thinking about Susan," I added. "About how she would feel if I pulled away." Cody's eyes softened. "You don't have to abandon anyone." I looked at him, desperate. "But it feels like I do." He shook his head. "No. It feels like it because it's big and messy, and no one hands you a manual for this." He reached for my hand. "But you can love Susan and Greg and still want to know Linda and Michael. You can hold more than one truth." I wanted to believe that. But then, an email arrived from the DNA company, not a marketing email, but a serious one. It was about an investigation, about law enforcement requests, about a case tied to fraudulent adoptions in the 1990s. The words were careful, legal. Cody read it and his face went pale. "They're saying this might be a criminal matter," he said quietly. My stomach dropped. "It is a criminal matter," I whispered. I was stolen. The reality shifted again, from personal heartbreak to something sharper. There were people out there who had made money off a child's disappearance, who had sold me like an object. The adoption agency name, West Coast Family Services, felt like something rotten on my tongue. I called Susan the next day. I told her about the email. She cried quietly. "We kept the paperwork," she said. "We have everything. If it helps. If it helps find the people who did this, we'll give it." I closed my eyes. "Thank you." "Brandy," Susan whispered. "I'm so sorry." "I know," I said. "Me too." A week later, I received a call from a detective in California. Linda had apparently reopened the case through her local department. My DNA match had been the break they needed to connect old files with new technology. The detective's voice was professional but kind. "We'd like to confirm some details," he said. "We may need your cooperation if this goes to court." Court. The word made my skin crawl. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at my hands. These hands that wrote on whiteboards, wiped toddler noses, graded papers. These hands belonged to a woman with a normal life. But my past wasn't normal. That night, I told Cody something I hadn't admitted out loud yet. "I'm angry," I whispered in the dark. "I'm angry at whoever took me. But I'm also angry at everything. At the time I lost. At the fact that I didn't know. Cody's arms tightened around me. You're allowed to be angry. I don't know who I am, I confessed. I don't know if I'm Brandy or Debbie. Cody kissed my forehead. You're both, he said simply. You're the person who lived the life you lived, and you're the person who was stolen. Both are true. I cried into his shirt. The decision, if it could be called that, didn't come as a dramatic moment of clarity. It came in pieces, like a quilt stitched together from pain and love and responsibility. It came when Linda sent me a voicemail at 2 in the morning, not realizing the time difference. Her voice was hoarse. I had a dream you were little again, she said. You were sitting on the kitchen floor, and you looked up at me and said, Mommy, I'm here. I woke up and I couldn't breathe. It came when Melissa messaged me a photo of herself at 9 years old, holding a handmade sign that said Welcome home, Debbie, dated years after I'd vanished, as if she'd kept making them just in case. It came when Jason told me, quietly, that he joined the military partly because he wanted to feel like he could protect people, because he hadn't been able to protect me. It came when Michael said, in a voice that cracked, every birthday of yours was a day we couldn't celebrate. We'd just survive it. How could I not go to them? And yet, the guilt towards Susan and Greg gnawed at me. They had poured their love into me without knowing they were holding someone else's stolen child. They didn't deserve to be punished for someone else's crime. So I did something that felt like walking into fire. I invited Susan and Greg to my house in Corvallis. I told Linda and Michael I wanted to bring everyone together. Not all at once, not yet, but that I needed to tell my adoptive parents what I was going to do. Susan and Greg arrived on a Saturday, carrying a casserole like they always did, as if food could fix things. Susan's eyes were swollen already. We sat at the kitchen table. Cody took the boys to the backyard to play so they wouldn't hear. I looked at Susan and Greg, my mom and dad in every way that mattered, and my throat tightened. I'm going to California, I said quietly. To meet them in person. Susan's face crumpled, but she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Greg swallowed hard. When? Next week, I said. I want to bring the boys eventually. But first I need to go alone. I need to see what it feels like. Susan reached across the table and grabbed my hands, squeezing. I'm terrified, she admitted, voice shaking. But I understand. Tears spilled down my cheeks. I'm not leaving you, I whispered. I don't want to hurt you. Susan sobbed. Oh, honey. We're hurt already because you're hurt. Greg's eyes shone. You have a right to know, he said quietly. You have a right to go back and see what was taken from you. I stared at him. Doesn't it make you angry? I asked. That they might, I couldn't finish. That they might take you from us, Greg said, voice rough. I nodded. Greg exhaled slowly. We didn't give birth to you, he said. We didn't lose you for 30 years. But we loved you for 30 years. That love doesn't disappear. He looked at Susan, then back at me. If you need to choose them as your origin, your truth, then we can survive that. Susan shook her head fiercely. We want you happy, she said, voice breaking. We want you whole. Even if it hurts. Their generosity gutted me. I realized then, the people who loved me were not demanding I choose. Only my fear was demanding it. Still, I knew the truth I couldn't avoid. There was a difference between the family who raised me and the family who had been robbed of me. And someone, somewhere inside me, wanted to go home. The morning of my flight to California, I stood in the airport bathroom staring at my reflection. My hair was pulled back. My eyes looked older than 35. I looked like a teacher, like a mother, like someone who had memorized routines. But under my calm face, a little girl was screaming. I boarded the plane with shaking hands. When we landed, the air felt different, drier, warmer, smelling faintly of sun-baked pavement. I rented a car and drove toward the address Linda had given me. My hands sweated on the steering wheel. When I pulled onto their street, I almost turned around. My chest tightened, panic rising like a wave. But then I saw a woman standing in the driveway, hands clasped together, rocking slightly on her feet. Linda. She was smaller than she looked on screen. Her hair was brown with a bit of gray, her face lined. But her eyes were the same as in the photo. Waiting. Praying. As I got out of the car, she stepped forward slowly, like she was afraid to scare me away. Brandy, she whispered. I stood frozen. My throat closed. I couldn't move. She lifted a trembling hand, not touching me yet, as if asking permission. I won't, she said, voice breaking. I won't touch you if you don't want. I made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and stepped forward. When her arms wrapped around me, something in my body released like a knot untying. It wasn't a memory, exactly. It was a sensation. A feeling of being held by someone who had been missing this weight for decades. Linda sobbed against my shoulder. My baby, she whispered over and over. My baby, I cried too, shaking. The driveway blurred into nothing but warmth and grief. Behind her, the front door opened. Michael stepped out. He was taller than I expected. His hair was gray, his face weathered, and his eyes were raw. He stopped a few feet away, as if he didn't trust his legs. His hands hung at his sides, trembling. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then he said, "Hi, Debbie." I flinched at the name, but not from rejection, more like a bell ringing in a distant room. "I'm Brandy," I whispered automatically. Michael nodded quickly, tears spilling. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." He swallowed. "I'm just so happy you're alive." Alive. That word landed heavy. Linda stepped back enough to look at my face, cupping my cheeks like she was afraid I'd vanish. "You're here," she whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. Michael took a step closer, hesitant. "May I?" he asked quietly, his voice breaking. I nodded again. When he hugged me, it was different, stiffer, like a man trying not to break. But I felt his body tremble, and I realized he'd been carrying this pain so long it had become bone deep. "Welcome home," he whispered. Home. The word cracked something open. Inside their house, photos covered the walls, Melissa and Jason growing up, birthdays, graduations. In the middle of it all, tucked among the frames like a wound that refused to heal, were photos of me as a toddler. Debbie. They had kept me present in their home, even in my absence. Melissa and Jason arrived soon after, and the moment Melissa saw me, she cried so hard she nearly collapsed. She grabbed my hands, staring at my fingers like they were proof. "I can't believe you're real," she sobbed. "I've imagined you so many ways." Jason stood beside her, tears running down his face, and he just shook his head like he couldn't process it. That day was overwhelming. Too many emotions. Too many eyes on me. Too much history pressing in. At one point, I escaped to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror again. My face looked flushed, my eyes swollen. I looked like someone who had been reborn and didn't know what to do with the new air in her lungs. I whispered, barely audible, "Debbie." The name felt strange, but not wrong. Like trying on a childhood sweater you'd forgotten existed. When I came back out, Linda was sitting on the couch holding a small box. "I kept some things," she said softly. "Only if you want to see. If it's too much, we don't have to." I nodded, my throat tight. She opened the box carefully. Inside was a faded pink jacket. A small stuffed dog, worn and loved. A child's drawing, scribbles and stick figures. Linda's hands shook. "This was yours," she whispered. I reached out and touched the jacket. The fabric was soft, like memory. My fingers trembled. And then something happened. Something so small and yet it made me gasp. The smell. It was faint, but it was there, a hint of detergent and old cotton and something that tugged at the back of my mind. I blinked hard and suddenly an image flashed, brief and blurry. A kitchen. Sunlight. A woman's laugh. My own tiny hands holding a stuffed dog. It vanished as quickly as it came, leaving me breathless. Linda watched me, eyes wide. "What?" she whispered. "I saw something," I said shackily. "Just a second." Like a memory. Linda pressed a hand to her mouth and sobbed. In that moment, the choice I'd been dreading didn't feel like a betrayal anymore. It felt like a truth surfacing. I could love Susan and Greg. I would always love them. But Linda and Michael weren't just an alternate set of parents. They were the people who had carried my absence like a scar. They were the origin of a part of me I didn't know I'd lost. And I realized I didn't want to live the rest of my life with that part locked away. When I flew back to Oregon, I cried in the airport. Cody met me at baggage claim, and the moment I saw him, I fell into his arms. He held me like he was catching me from a fall. "How was it?" he whispered. I laughed through tears. "Hard," I said. And good. And I don't know. Like being cracked open." He kissed my forehead. "I'm proud of you." At home, Hunter threw himself at me, and River clung to my leg, shouting, "Mommy," like he needed to confirm I was real. I held them both and breathed them in, grounding myself in the life I'd built. That night, after the boys were asleep, I called Susan. She answered on the first ring, voice tight. "Hi, honey." "Hi," I whispered. My throat ached. I met them. Silence. Then Susan's shaky breath. "Okay. They're kind," I said softly. And broken. And I think they've been living half alive for decades. Susan didn't speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was small. Do you feel like you belong there? I closed my eyes. That was the question. I thought about Linda's arms around me. Michael's trembling hug. Melissa's sobs. Jason's stunned smile. The photos of me on their wall. I feel like something in me belongs there, I whispered. Like a piece that was missing. Susan made a quiet sound, pain, acceptance, love tangled together. I understand, she whispered and her voice broke. I don't like it. But I understand. I don't want to lose you, I said, tears spilling. You won't, Susan said fiercely, and I heard her straighten like a spine stiffening. I'm your mom too, Brandy. I don't care what the DNA says. I'm not letting go, I sobbed into my hand. Thank you. In the months that followed, my life became a bridge. I kept teaching. I kept packing lunches and wiping noses. The ordinary didn't disappear, but it changed flavor, like the same meal seasoned differently. I helped law enforcement with paperwork. Susan and Greg handed over every document they had, furious at the scam, heartbroken for Linda. The adoption company, long dissolved, became a trail of names, old addresses, and the ghosts of people who had made money selling stolen children. Some nights, I lay awake thinking about the woman in the park. The question about the water fountain. The moment Linda looked away. I didn't remember it. But now, as a mother, I felt it in my bones. I began flying to California with Cody and the boys. The first time Linda met Hunter and River, she cried so hard she could barely speak. My grandbabies, she whispered, hands trembling as she touched Hunter's cheek. Hunter, being Hunter, asked, Are you my grandma? Linda laughed through tears. Yes, she said. If you'll have me, Hunter nodded solemnly. Okay. Then he added, Do you have snacks? Linda laughed, and the sound had sunlight in it. When Michael held River, River patted his face and said, Hi, like it was the simplest thing in the world. Michael's eyes filled and he whispered, Hi buddy, as if he'd been waiting for that tiny greeting his whole life. I watched them together and felt something settle in me. Not everything became easy. There were awkward moments. There were times Susan and Greg struggled, times Linda and Michael reached too fast, times I felt overwhelmed by being two people at once. But gradually, I stopped thinking of it as choosing one family and abandoning the other. I stopped thinking of love as a finite resource. Still, when the question returned, who am I? My answer shifted. I began to say, quietly to myself, I was Debbie. I began to say it not like a betrayal of Brandy, but like an acknowledgement of a truth that had been buried. Even though everyone agreed on the truth, the legal process wasn't simple. The state had to correct forged records, reopen a cold kidnapping case, and untangle an adoption that had shaped 32 years of my life. My lawyer, Mr. Hooper, warned me that the court couldn't erase the past. It could only acknowledge what had been stolen. Mr. Hooper spread the documents across the table and looked at me carefully. Legally speaking, he said, this is complicated. I stared at him. Complicated how? Because two things can be true at once, he replied. You were kidnapped, and you were adopted in good faith by people who believed everything was legal. My stomach twisted. So what does that mean? It means the court has to correct the fraud, he said. But it also has to recognize the life you lived for more than 30 years. The law moves slower than emotions. I hadn't expected the paperwork to be one of the hardest parts. My birth certificate said one thing. My school records said another. My driver's license carried a name that technically shouldn't exist. The lawyer warned me it could take months to untangle. You've lived 32 years as Brandy Hart and later as Brandy Owens, he said. The law doesn't undo that overnight. Then it was time for Susan and Greg to meet Linda and Michael before the court hearing that would formally restore my original identity. The meeting almost didn't happen. Not because anyone refused. Not because anyone was angry enough to say no. But because none of us quite knew how to step into a room that contained so much history and pain. Two sets of parents. One daughter. 32 years of life in between. It was Linda who finally suggested it. The day before the hearing, she said gently over the phone. Maybe we could meet. Just talk. Not about court. Just as people. My stomach had twisted the moment she said it. Because I wanted it. And I was terrified of it. The next evening, we met at a small restaurant near the courthouse. Nothing fancy, just a quiet place with warm lights and wooden tables where nobody paid attention to the people sitting in the corner. Cody sat beside me, his steady presence keeping me grounded. Linda and Michael arrived first. Linda had clearly tried to make herself look calm. Her hair was neatly pinned back, and she wore a soft blue sweater. But I could see the tension in the way she clasped her hands together. Michael stood slightly behind her, tall and quiet, his expression serious in that way he had when he was trying to hold too many emotions at once. A few minutes later, Susan and Greg walked in. My heart began pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Susan spotted me first and smiled, but the smile trembled at the edges. Greg rested a hand lightly on her back as they approached. For a moment, all four of them stood there. No one quite knew what to do. Then Linda took a step forward. "Hello," she said softly. Her voice shook. Susan nodded politely, gripping her purse with both hands. "Hello." The silence stretched for a few seconds too long. Finally Greg cleared his throat and offered his hand to Michael. "Greg Hart," he said. Michael shook it firmly. "Michael Eaton." Their handshake was strong but careful, two men acknowledging each other while standing in the strangest moment of their lives. Then Linda turned to Susan. "I'm Linda," she said, unnecessarily. "I know," Susan replied gently. For a second they simply looked at each other. Both women had cried for the same child in completely different ways. And somehow, that truth filled the space between them. Linda's voice broke first. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. Susan blinked, startled. "Thank me?" "For raising her," Linda said. "For loving her. For keeping her safe all those years." Susan's eyes filled with tears almost instantly. "I didn't know," she whispered. "We truly didn't know." "I believe you," Linda said immediately. That seemed to release something in Susan's shoulders, like she had been holding that fear for months. "We would never have," Susan began, then stopped, her voice cracking. "I know," Linda said again. Greg gestured toward the table. "Maybe we should sit." We all sat down slowly. At first the conversation was awkward. Small things. Safe things. The kind of polite talk strangers make when they don't know what else to say. But these weren't strangers. They were people connected by the same child. After a few minutes, Michael looked at Greg. "You taught her to ride a bike," he said quietly. Greg blinked in surprise. "She told you that?" Michael nodded. Greg gave a small smile. "She was stubborn. Fell 3 times and refused to quit." Linda laughed softly through her tears. "She was stubborn at 3 too." Susan wiped her eyes with a napkin. "She loved reading," she said. "From the time she was little. We could barely get her to put books down." Linda smiled gently. "That hasn't changed." Slowly the conversation shifted. They talked about me. Not like I was an object being passed between them, but like a story they had both been part of. Greg told them about my first day of kindergarten. Linda told them about how I used to insist on wearing mismatched shoes as a toddler. Michael listened quietly most of the time, but every now and then he asked something simple. "Did she like school? Was she happy?" Susan nodded each time. "Yes," she said firmly. "She was very happy." Michael closed his eyes briefly, relief washing over his face. At one point Linda turned to Susan again. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Susan looked confused. "For what?" "For what tomorrow will feel like for you." Susan shook her head slowly. "It will hurt," she admitted. "But not because of you." She looked at me then, her eyes warm even through the tears. "It hurts because I love her." Linda nodded. "I understand that," she whispered. For a moment, the two women reached across the table at the same time and their hands touched. Neither of them pulled away. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No speeches. No perfect resolution. Just two mothers holding on to the same truth. When we finally left the restaurant, the air outside was cool and quiet. Greg shook Michael's hand again. Linda hugged Susan gently. It was awkward, emotional, imperfect. But it was also something none of us had expected. Respect. Understanding. As we walked back toward the car, Cody slipped his arm around my shoulders. "Well," he murmured softly. I wiped my eyes and let out a shaky breath. That was the strangest dinner in human history. Cody smiled. "Yeah," he said. Then he squeezed me gently. But maybe also the most important one. The courthouse didn't look dramatic. That surprised me. For something that had the power to rewrite my life on paper, it was an ordinary building, gray stone, quiet hallways, fluorescent lights humming softly above polished floors. People passed by carrying folders and coffee cups like this was just another workday. Maybe for them it was. For me, it felt like standing in the center of a storm. Cody squeezed my hand as we sat on the wooden bench outside the courtroom. His thumb rubbed slow circles over my knuckles, a silent way of telling me to breathe. "You okay?" he whispered. "No," I said honestly. My voice sounded thin even to me. Across the hall, Linda sat beside Michael, both of them stiff with nerves. Melissa and Jason were there too, close together like they had been when I first saw them on the video call months ago. Susan and Greg sat a little farther down the bench. Seeing them all in the same place made my chest ache. Two families. Two histories. The hearing was explained to me in careful legal language over 2 phone calls and a stack of documents I could barely stand to read. The criminal case was about the people who had stolen and sold children. Susan and Greg had already been acquitted. They had only paid a small fee, not bought a child. The family court matter was about correcting the records that had built my life on a lie. No one could erase the 32 years Susan and Greg had raised me, but on paper the state was preparing to acknowledge what had always been true. I had been Deborah Eaton before I was ever Brandy Owens. Even knowing that, I dreaded the hearing. I dreaded what it would do to Susan. I dreaded what it would make official. One courtroom deciding what my name meant. The investigation had moved faster than any of us expected. Once the old adoption records surfaced, the prosecutors traced the adoption agency, West Coast Family Services, to a criminal ring that had trafficked stolen children in the 1990s. Several cases had been buried for years, but DNA technology had reopened them. Mine was one of the clearest. A child taken from a park. Sold through a fraudulent adoption agency. Documents forged. The judge now had the authority to declare the adoption invalid. Legally speaking, I had never been meant to belong to the family that raised me. That sentence alone made my stomach twist. A bailiff opened the door. "They're ready," he said. We stood slowly, like people walking toward something irreversible. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wooden benches, a raised bench for the judge, a flag in the corner. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. But my heart was beating so hard it felt like it filled the room. Cody stayed beside me. Linda and Michael sat behind us. Susan and Greg sat behind them. The layers of my life stacked in rows. The judge entered, an older woman with sharp glasses and a calm face that suggested she had seen every kind of human story imaginable. We stood as she took her seat. "Please be seated," she said. Papers rustled softly as lawyers arranged documents. My hands were shaking in my lap. The prosecutor warned us that the judge might not fully revoke the adoption. "Sometimes courts keep the adoption legally intact," he explained, and simply acknowledged the biological family. The idea made my stomach drop. I didn't want to erase Susan and Greg. But I also didn't want the law pretending Linda and Michael were strangers. The prosecutor explained the case again for the record facts I knew but still felt unreal hearing out loud. Deborah Eaton was abducted in 1993 at age 3. She was later placed through the fraudulent agency known as West Coast Family Services. The adoption of the child by Gregory and Susan Hart was conducted under falsified documentation. I flinched at the formal version of my life. The prosecutor continued. DNA evidence now conclusively identifies the adult known as Brandy Owens as Deborah Eaton, biological daughter of Linda and Michael Eaton. Silence filled the room. The judge studied the file for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. and Mrs. Hart," she said, looking toward Susan and Greg, "there is no indication that you are aware of the criminal activity involved in this adoption." Susan's shoulders trembled. Greg nodded slowly. The judge's voice softened slightly. "The court recognizes that you raised this child in good faith and with care." My throat tightened. Then the judge looked toward me. "However," she continued, "because the adoption was conducted through fraudulent means and involved the trafficking of a kidnapped child, the adoption cannot legally stand." The room felt suddenly too small. My ears rang as the judge spoke the words that would permanently change the record of my life. "This court finds that the adoption records were procured through fraud and orders that the relevant identity records be corrected accordingly." The gavel struck once. The sound echoed through the room like a door closing. For a moment, nobody moved. On paper, the state was correcting the lie that had carried me into their home. Even though my heart knew they had raised me, even though my memories were filled with them. Tears slid down my face before I realized I was crying. Behind me, I heard Susan quietly sob. Linda reached for Michael's hand, her own shaking uncontrollably. The judge continued more gently. "This ruling restores the legal identity of Deborah Eaton. However, the court acknowledges the unique emotional circumstances of this case. The relationships formed over 30 years cannot be erased by legal documents. Her words felt like a small kindness in a moment that otherwise felt brutal. The hearing ended quickly after that. Just paperwork. Just signatures and official language deciding something that had taken decades to happen. When we stepped outside the courtroom again, the hallway felt brighter than before. Too bright. Susan walked toward me slowly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached out and took my face in her hands the same way she had when I was little. "You will always be my daughter," she whispered. The words broke something inside me. "I know," I said, my voice shaking. Behind us, Linda stood quietly, giving us space. Because she understood something too. The court had changed my legal identity. It had restored the truth of where I came from. But it could not erase the love that had raised me. I turned then, looking between the two women who had shaped my life in completely different ways. Susan and Linda, both crying, both loving me. For the first time since the judge spoke, I understood something clearly. The court had restored my name, Debbie Eaton. But the life I had lived, the love I had received, had also made me Brandy Owens. And no court in the world could take that away. The detective reminded me that the family court case was only one piece of the story. Restoring your identity is one thing, he said. Proving who took you and who sold you is another. Some of the people involved were dead. Some had vanished. Some might still be alive. The law was still chasing ghosts from 30 years ago. The decision didn't arrive like a drumroll. It arrived like most adult decisions do, quietly, in the middle of a Tuesday, while I was packing apple slices into a lunchbox and trying not to think about how many different versions of my life now existed at once. Cody leaned against the counter, watching me seal Hunter's container like it was a sacred ritual. "You're doing it again," he said gently. "Doing what?" I tried to sound normal, but my voice came out thin. He tipped his chin toward my face. "That look. Like you're trying to solve a math problem no one gave you the equation for." I exhaled, letting the lunchbox rest on the counter. My hands were trembling just slightly. "I don't want to keep living like we're visiting," I admitted. "Like, I fly down there and then come back here and pretend I'm not split in half." Cody stepped closer. He didn't touch me right away. He waited, like he always did when he could tell I was scared of my own feelings. "So what do you want?" I stared at the cabinet doors, at the small smudges from sticky fingers. "I want them to be real," I said. "Not just a screen. Not just a weekend every couple months." His eyebrows lifted, soft but alert. "Okay. And I want the boys to know them," I added, voice gaining strength as I said it out loud. "To know my sister and brother. To know Linda and Michael as their grandparents, not as nice people Mom cries about after phone calls." Cody nodded slowly. His hand finally found mine, lacing fingers like an anchor. "You're talking about moving," he said. I swallowed. Saying it made it real. "Yes," I whispered. "I'm talking about moving." For a moment, the kitchen was full of ordinary sounds, the refrigerator hum, River's feet thumping upstairs, the faint clink of Cody's wedding ring against the countertop when he shifted his weight. Ordinary life, trying to keep pace with a not ordinary truth. Cody didn't look shocked. He didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful in a way that made my chest loosen. "Okay," he said again. "Let's talk it through. Real talk. Not panic talk." A laugh escaped me, shaky. "I don't know if I can do real talk. I'm pretty fluent in panic." "I'm your translator," he said, and squeezed my hand. That night, after the boys were asleep, we sat on the couch with a notebook between us like we were planning a road trip, not uprooting our entire life. Cody clicked his pen. "Start with why," he said. "Why California?" My throat tightened. "Because every time I leave Linda's house, it feels like ripping something out of me." I stared at the blank notebook page. "And because I keep imagining Hunter and River growing up without knowing this part of me. Like I'm hiding something important from them." Cody nodded. "Okay. What else?" "Because I don't want to make up for lost time by losing more time," I said quietly. "I already lost 30 years with them. I don't want to lose another 10 because I was scared to change my address." Cody's expression softened. "And the hard parts?" I didn't answer right away because the hard parts came in a pile. Susan and Greg. My classroom. My routine. The safety of the familiar. The guilt. "I'm afraid," I admitted finally, "that moving makes it official. Like I'm choosing." Cody leaned back, eyes on the ceiling for a beat. "You are choosing," he said carefully. "But not in a cruel way. You're choosing proximity. You're choosing time. That's not the same thing as choosing love." The words landed in me like warmth. And I'm not going to pretend it won't be hard, he added. I love Oregon. I love our life here. But I love you more. And I love what it does to you when you're with them. You come back, different. Different bad? I whispered. He shook his head. Different whole. Like you've been carrying a heavy backpack you didn't know you were wearing, and every time you go there, someone takes one brick out of it. I covered my mouth with my hand, tears rising fast. Cody reached for the notebook and wrote in big letters, Move to California? Then underneath, FOR, family, healing, kids' grandparents, and uncle, truth, time against. Leaving Susan and Greg nearby, leaving school, cost, fear, guilt. He tapped the page. We'll do this the right way, he said. Not impulsive. Not self-punishing. But if we decide yes, we commit. We don't half-step. Something inside me steadied at that. Cody was my steady. He always had been. The first phone call I made after we decided to seriously consider it was to Susan. I sat in my car in the driveway because I couldn't do it in the house where the boys might overhear. The steering wheel was cold under my palms. Susan answered on the second ring. Hi, honey. Her voice was so normal it almost made me turn back. Almost. Hi, I said, and swallowed. Mom, I need to talk to you about something. There was a pause. Okay. I breathed in slowly. Cody and I are thinking about moving to California, I said. To be closer to Linda and Michael. So I can spend time with them. So the boys can know them. The silence on the other end felt like stepping off a cliff. Then Susan exhaled, long and shaky. Oh, she whispered. Okay. Are you mad? My voice broke on the word. No, she said quickly, too quickly, and that told me everything. No. I'm sad, Brandy. I'm sad and scared. But I'm not mad. Tears ran down my cheeks, hot and relentless. I don't want to hurt you. I know, Susan whispered. And I don't want you to stay here out of guilt. I squeezed my eyes shut. It feels like guilt is the only language my body knows right now. Susan let out a wet laugh that turned into a sob. Oh, honey. I love you, I said, urgent, like love could patch the hole this was tearing. I love you too, she replied. And I know why you have to do this. I know. Her kindness broke me open in a new way. Because it would have been easier if she'd yelled. If she'd made herself the villain. But Susan had never been a villain in my story. Will you come visit? I asked quietly. Will you still be part of our lives? Susan sniffed. Of course, she said, steadying herself. We'll visit. We'll FaceTime. Greg will complain about airports, but we'll do it. Her voice softened. Just promise me you won't disappear from us, Brandy. I won't, I whispered. I promise. After I hung up, I sat with my forehead against the steering wheel and cried until my chest hurt. Then I called Linda. This time I sat at the kitchen table with Cody beside me, his hand resting on my knee like a silent vote of confidence. Linda answered, breathless. Brandy? Hi, I said, and my voice wobbled. I have something to tell you. Her tone shifted immediately, alert with fear. Are you okay? I'm okay, I said quickly. I'm nervous. Cody and I have been talking, and we think we might move to California. For a second there was nothing, like the line had gone dead. Then Linda made a sound, pure, stunned joy, and immediately tried to swallow it like she was afraid to scare me away. You, she whispered. You'd really do that? I want to, I said, tears spilling again because apparently my body had decided this was simply how I'd communicate forever now. I want to be close. I want time with you, real time. Linda started crying openly. I could hear her trying to breathe around the sobs. Oh, sweetheart, she choked. Oh my God. You have no idea what that means. I think I do, I whispered. Because it means something to me too. Cody leaned in, close to the phone. Hi, Linda, he said gently. It's Cody. Linda's sobs turned into a laugh. Cody, she cried. Thank you. Cody's voice was calm but thick with emotion. We're still figuring out details, he said. But we want the boys to grow up knowing all of you. Linda's voice broke. We'll help, she said immediately. Anything. Finding a place, schools, jobs, anything. Just give us patience, I said. I'm still scared. Of course, Linda whispered. We'll go at your speed. But whatever you need, we're here. When I hung up, my hands shook so hard Cody took the phone from me and set it down. You okay? He asked. I stared at him through tears. I feel like I just jumped off something, I said. And I don't know if there's water or rocks at the bottom. Cody kissed my forehead. There's water, he said. And I'm jumping with you. The next weeks were full of logistics, the kind of adult tasks that keep you from drowning in feelings because they demand you stay practical. We researched towns that made sense, close enough to Linda and Michael to see them often, but far enough to have our own space. Not too expensive. Good schools. Safe neighborhoods. Places where a third-grade teacher could find work and a man like Cody, who could fix anything and had a steady job history, could find something too. We landed on a town that felt like a compromise between sunlight and sanity, Ventura. It wasn't the town I'd been stolen from. Linda and Michael lived farther inland, but it was close enough for weekend dinners and after-school visits. Close enough for come-over-for-nothing afternoons. Close enough for the boys to have grandparents who could show up for a preschool program or a birthday party without buying plane tickets. When we told Hunter, we kept it simple. We're moving, I said, sitting with him on the rug, River climbing onto my lap like a determined koala. We're going to live closer to Grandma Linda and Grandpa Michael. Hunter's eyes went wide. The grandma who has snacks? I laughed through the lump in my throat. Yes, that grandma. He considered this deeply. Will my toys come? Yes, Cody said, solemn as if delivering a promise to a king. All your toys. Hunter nodded. Okay, can we bring the spaceship? Absolutely, Cody said. We'll pack it like a treasure. River clapped and shouted, beach. Because he'd overheard the word California and attached it to the only concept of California he had, sand. Later, when the boys were asleep, I sat alone in the living room and let myself imagine it. Imagine Linda dropping by on a Wednesday just because she'd made too much soup and wanted to bring some over. Imagine Melissa picking Hunter up for an afternoon at the zoo. Imagine Jason teaching River how to throw a ball. Imagine my kids having a family that existed in the same time zone. Imagine me learning the shape of my own beginning not in frantic phone calls and hurried visits, but slowly, like you learn a language by living inside it. There was fear in the imagining, of course there was. But there was also relief. The day we told Linda and Michael the town we'd chosen, they came to meet us halfway at a small restaurant, like they couldn't wait another second to make it real. When I walked in, Linda stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. Michael rose too, slower, but with the same urgency. They hugged me without asking this time, and I didn't flinch. Over tacos and watery iced tea, we talked about normal things, lease lengths, daycare, job applications, the best parks in Ventura. Normal things, like we were any family planning any move. But every so often, Linda would look at me with an expression that was too loaded for tacos. At one point, she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her fingers were warm and trembling. I want to say something, she said quietly. Michael looked down at his plate, jaw clenched, like he was holding himself together. Linda swallowed. I don't want you to feel like you owe us this, she said. I don't want this move to be your penance. It's not your job to pay for what someone else did. My eyes burned. It doesn't feel like penance, I admitted. It feels like a chance. Linda nodded, tears gathering. Then we'll treat it like that, she whispered. A chance, not a debt. Michael cleared his throat, voice rough. And you'll have space, he said, surprising me with the steadiness of it. We won't be on your porch every day. Unless you want us to be. A laugh burst out of me, half sob. Thank you, I smiled to her. Cody raised his glass slightly. To space and snacks, he said, and Linda laughed, and for the first time in a long time, the laughter didn't feel like something squeezed out between tragedies. It felt real. The move itself was chaotic, as moves always are, boxes and tape and last-minute panic. Susan and Greg came to help pack, and that was one of the hardest days of my life. Susan folded tiny shirts with trembling hands, wiping her eyes when she thought I wasn't watching. Greg carried boxes to the truck with silent determination, as if muscle could keep grief from spilling. At one point, I found Susan alone in the hallway outside Hunter's room, holding a small drawing he'd made for her, stick figures labeled Grandma Susan and me. Her shoulders shook. I stepped closer, voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Susan turned to me, eyes wet. Don't be, she said fiercely. Don't you dare be sorry for going toward your truth. She pressed the drawing to her chest. I'm heartbroken, yes. But I'm also proud of you. My throat closed. I hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of her perfume, trying to memorize it the way you memorize anything you're afraid of losing. I'll call, I whispered. I know, she said. And I'll come. And you'll come here too. Her voice softened. We're not done. We're just expanding. Expanding. That word helped. When we finally pulled out of our driveway in Oregon, Hunter pressed his face to the window, watching the trees blur past. "My house," he called, waving. River echoed, "Bye," like he was waving to the entire state. I stared forward as the road stretched out, my hands steady on the steering wheel for once. Cody reached over and squeezed my thigh. "You okay?" I swallowed. "I'm terrified," I admitted. "Same," he said, and smiled a little. "But also kind of excited." I glanced at him, surprised. "Excited?" He shrugged. "Sunshine. New start. And watching you get something back you should have had all along." His voice softened. "That's worth being scared for." As we crossed the border into California days later, the air warmed, the sky widened, and palm trees appeared like punctuation marks in a sentence I'd never learned to read before. Leaving Linwood Elementary was harder than I expected. I packed up my classroom one bulletin board at a time, hugging coworkers in hallways that had held the shape of my ordinary life. By the time I found a third-grade teaching job in Ventura, I felt scraped raw by change. Still, on my first morning in my new classroom, with fresh pencils in neat jars and sunlight pouring through unfamiliar windows, I understood that starting over was not the same thing as losing everything. And then, on our first weekend in Ventura, Linda and Michael came over. Not to overwhelm. Not to claim. Just to be there. Linda arrived with a casserole dish and a bag of snacks for Hunter like she'd been preparing for this role her whole life. Michael brought a small toolbox, because Cody had mentioned something about a loose cabinet door, and the two men ended up in the kitchen, crouched side by side, tightening screws like they were building more than wood. Melissa and Jason came later, carrying popsicles, laughing, crowding into our small new living room like they belonged there. Hunter raced around showing off his spaceship. River climbed into Linda's lap without hesitation, fascinated by her earrings. At some point, Linda caught my eye across the room. She didn't say anything. She just smiled, a smile so full of relief it made my chest ache, and mouthed, "You're here." I pressed a hand to my heart and nodded. Because I was. I was here in California, with my husband and my sons and the family that had been stolen from me and still loved me anyway. And for the first time since that rainy Sunday in Oregon, my life didn't feel like a split story. It felt like the beginning and the middle were finally reaching for each other, slowly, awkwardly, painfully, but truly. Like we were building an ending that didn't erase anyone, just made room for everyone. In California, I made a decision about my name. Legally, I reclaimed Deborah as part of who I was. But I did not want to erase the life I had lived as Brandy Owens, the life my husband and children knew, the life I had built with my own hands. In the end, I chose to carry both. On paper, I became Deborah Brandy Owens. In Ventura, in my new daily life, most people came to know me as Debbie. With Linda and Michael, with my siblings, and gradually even with myself, I let that name become real again. At school I was still Mrs. Owens, the name my students used every day. Only a few people from before, Susan and Greg most of all, still called me Brandy. By the time we had been in Ventura for a few weeks, meeting Linda and Michael had begun to feel almost normal. They came by sometimes with groceries or leftovers, Michael fixing small things around the house that Cody swore he could handle but secretly appreciated. Hunter had already decided Michael was the best grandpa in the world because he knew how to build things out of cardboard. River had decided Linda's lap was the safest place on earth. But there was still a part of the family I hadn't met. The rest of them. Melissa's husband. Jason's wife. Their kids. My nieces and nephews. The words still felt strange in my head, like shoes I was trying on for the first time. Linda suggested a Saturday barbecue at her house. "Nothing big," she promised gently on the phone. "Just everyone together so you can meet properly." Nothing big. I stood in my kitchen afterwards staring at the phone like it had just scheduled my heart surgery. Cody noticed immediately. "Family summit?" he asked. "Family swarm," I muttered. He smiled and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "You'll survive." "I'm not sure about that," I said. Linda and Michael's house smelled like grilled chicken and warm bread when we arrived. The boys ran ahead of us the moment we got out of the car. "Grandma Linda," Hunter shouted, launching himself toward the porch like a tiny missile. Linda caught him in a hug, laughing through the impact. "There's my favorite astronaut." River toddled behind him yelling, "Snacks." Michael scooped him up easily. "This kid knows what matters." Cody squeezed my hand before we walked up the driveway. "You ready?" he asked quietly. "No," I said honestly. "Good," he said. "Me neither." Melissa was already there. She came out the front door almost the moment she saw us and wrapped me in a hug that nearly lifted my feet off the ground. Okay, she said, wiping her eyes as she stepped back. Deep breath. Today you meet the rest of the chaos. Chaos sounds accurate, I said weakly. Melissa laughed and hooked her arm through mine like we'd been sisters our entire lives. Come on. Inside the backyard, the chaos was very real. Kids ran across the grass chasing a soccer ball. Someone had music playing softly from a speaker. A table was covered in bowls of chips, fruit, and something that looked like 3 different potato salads. Jason stood by the grill talking to a tall woman with dark hair. When he saw me, he immediately straightened. Everyone, he called. The yard quieted slightly. My stomach twisted. Jason walked over first, smiling in that careful, emotional way I was starting to recognize as family. Okay, he said. Moment of truth. He gestured to the woman beside him. This is my wife, Elena. Elena stepped forward and hugged me without hesitation. Hi, she said warmly. I've heard about you for months. I laughed nervously. Hopefully good things. Only good things, she said. And some very dramatic crying. That sounds accurate, I admitted. Jason grinned. And these 2 are our monsters, he said, pointing toward 2 kids racing across the yard. Mateo. Sophia. Come here. The older boy jogged over first, maybe 10 years old, with messy hair and curious eyes. This is your Aunt Debbie, Jason said. The word hit me right in the chest. Aunt. Mateo studied me seriously. So you're the one Dad keeps crying about, he said. Jason groaned. Kid. But I laughed. Yeah, I said. That's probably me. Mateo nodded like that explained everything. Then a smaller girl, Sophia, ran up and grabbed my hand without hesitation. Hi, Aunt Debbie, she said cheerfully. Just like that. No hesitation. No confusion. Just acceptance. Something in my chest loosened. Melissa clapped her hands suddenly. Oh, right, she said. My turn. She pulled a tall man forward. This is my husband, Daniel. Daniel shook my hand warmly. Welcome to the circus. Thank you, I said. I think. 2 more kids hovered nearby. My twins, Melissa said proudly. Liam and Chloe. They were about Hunter's age and stared at him like they had just discovered a new species. Hunter stared right back. Then Liam held up a toy dinosaur. Hunter gasped. Friendship was immediately declared. Within seconds the kids were running around the yard screaming about dinosaurs, spaceships, and popsicles. River wandered after them yelling, "Wait!" Everyone laughed. I stood there for a moment watching it all. Cody stepped beside me and slipped his arm around my waist. You okay? He asked softly. I looked across the yard. Jason and Mateo were showing Hunter how to kick the soccer ball. Melissa and Linda were talking while chopping fruit. Elena was helping Sophia carry drinks to the table. Michael sat in a chair holding River, who was explaining something very serious about trucks. And the strangest part was that it didn't feel like strangers. It felt like stepping into a story that had been running for years without me. But there was space. Space where I could step in. I leaned my head against Cody's shoulder. This is weird, I whispered. Good weird? He asked. I watched Hunter laugh as Mateo chased him across the grass. I watched Linda glance at me with that soft look she had when she still couldn't quite believe I was real. I took a slow breath. Yeah, I said. Then I smiled. Good weird. A year later, on my 36th birthday, Linda sent me a card. Inside, she wrote, Happy birthday, Debbie. My miracle. My heartbreak. My joy. Thank you for finding your way back to us. I stared at the words, tears blurring them. Later that day, Susan called and said, Happy birthday, Brandy, and her voice was steady and full of love. I realized then that my life didn't need to be a choice between one love and another. But when it came to the question of origin, of truth, of where my story began, there was no avoiding the answer. It began in California, as a little girl named Debbie Eaton, holding a stuffed dog and laughing in sunlight. It began with a family that lost her and never stopped looking. It began with a crime that stole time. And now, in Ventura, in California, in a classroom full of third graders who trusted me to be steady, I carried that truth with me, not as a wound that defined me, but as a root that finally had a name. One afternoon, years after everything began, I stood at the whiteboard writing a story prompt for my students. Write about a time you discovered something surprising about yourself. A boy raised his hand. Mrs. Owens, he said, can it be a scary surprise? I paused, marker hovering. I thought about a rainy Sunday. A laptop screen. 2 names. I thought about Linda's voice saying, "I've been waiting for this message for over 30 years." I thought about Susan's trembling hands, still holding mine even when it hurt. I smiled softly at my student. "Yes," I said. "It can be a scary surprise. Because sometimes, the scariest surprises are the ones that lead you back to the beginning, back to the part of you that was always there, waiting to be found." And sometimes, after all the confusion and fear, after all the grief and guilt, you don't just discover who you are. You come home.